The first wave. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. The sea itself seemed to conspire against them that morning. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, the English Channel heaved with a violence that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened soldiers. The landing craft pitched and rolled through waves that rose 6 feet and higher, their flat bottoms slamming against the water with a force that jarred every bone, every tooth, every desperate prayer muttered into the spray-soaked darkness. Men who had trained for 2 years, who had crossed an ocean, who had said goodbye to everything they loved, now hung over the sides of their vessels and retched into the black water, their bodies betraying them before they had even seen the enemy. They had been at sea for hours already. Some had boarded their landing craft while darkness still held the English coast, transferring from the larger transport ships that had carried them across from Portland and Weymouth. The transfer itself had been treacherous, men laden with 60 pounds of equipment and more, clambering down cargo nets that swung wildly against the steel hulls, dropping into the smaller craft that rose and fell with sickening unpredictability. Some men missed their footing. Some fell between the landing craft and the transport ship, their screams lost in the diesel roar and the crashing waves. Those who made it into the boats found no comfort there, only the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of human endurance before a single shot was fired. The soldiers of the first assault wave were packed into these landing craft like cargo, standing shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait and feel the cold water that sloshed around their boots and listen to the sounds of other men being sick. Some prayed aloud. Some prayed silently. Some had already moved beyond prayer into a kind of numb acceptance that whatever was coming would come, and that nothing they did in these final hours of darkness would change what awaited them on the far shore. They were soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, men who wore the big red one on their shoulders, veterans of North Africa and Sicily who knew what combat meant and who understood, with a clarity that terrified them, that this landing would be different from anything they had experienced before. They were soldiers of the 29th Infantry Division, the blue and gray, men from Virginia and Maryland who had trained endlessly but had never heard a shot fired in anger, who were about to receive the most brutal education in warfare that any American unit had ever endured. They were Rangers, elite troops of the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, specially trained for the impossible missions, for the vertical cliffs and the fortified positions, for the kind of work that required a particular species of control madness. Among them were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Pennsylvania, college students whose educations had been interrupted by war, and men who had never finished grade school. There were men who had lied about their age to enlist, and men who had been drafted against their will. There were husbands and fathers and sons and brothers. There were men who believed deeply in the cause, and men who simply believed in the men standing next to them. What united them all in those pre-dawn hours was a shared fate and a shared mission: to storm a beach that the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying, to break through defenses that had been designed specifically to slaughter anyone who attempted what they were about to attempt, to create a foothold on the coast of France so that the liberation of Europe could begin. The beach itself was code-named Omaha, a word chosen for its clarity in radio communications, a word that meant nothing to the Germans and everything to the men who would bleed across its sand. It stretched for 6,000 yards along the Normandy coast between the villages of Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville-sur-Mer, a crescent of coarse sand and smooth stones dominated by bluffs that rose as high as 170 feet. The bluffs were not merely geographical features. They were killing platforms. From their heights, German gunners possessed an unobstructed view of every yard of beach, every approach, every possible avenue of advance. They had positioned their weapons with methodical precision. Machine guns in concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, mortars pre-registered to target the waterline and the tidal flat, anti-tank guns covering the exits, and artillery pieces ranging from 75mm to 105mm caliber position to bring down fire from positions inland that the Allied naval bombardment could not reach. The German defenders belonged primarily to the 716th Infantry Division, a static defensive unit composed largely of older soldiers and conscript from occupied territories, supplemented by the battle-hardened troops of the 352nd Infantry Division, which had been moved into the sector just weeks before the invasion. The quality of these troops varied considerably, but their positions did not. They occupied fortifications that represented the culmination of German military engineering. Reinforced concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick, interconnected trenches, minefields containing millions of mines, both anti-personnel and anti-tank, and beach obstacles that had been meticulously placed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft and impale soldiers who tried to wade ashore. The obstacles themselves constituted a three-dimensional maze of death. Closest to the low-water mark stood the Belgian gates, heavy steel frameworks 10 feet high designed to tear open the hulls of landing craft. Beyond them were the ramps, angled steel beams intended to force boats to broach sideways to the surf and the German guns. Then came the hedgehogs, welded steel assemblies resembling giant jacks that could gut a landing craft or break a soldier's legs. Finally, closest to the high-water mark, wooden stakes had been driven into the sand at angles calculated to impale craft at high tide, many of them topped with teller mines that would detonate on contact. The Germans called this band of obstacles the Devil's Garden, and they had created it with the specific intention of channeling attackers into predetermined killing zones where machine guns and mortars could achieve maximum effect. The pre-invasion bombardment, which had been intended to neutralize these defenses, had largely failed. Naval guns had fired thousands of shells at Omaha Beach in the 40 minutes before the first wave was scheduled to land, but the combination of poor visibility, the high bluffs that provided defilade for German positions, and the inherent difficulty of hitting hardened bunkers from moving ships at sea had resulted in disappointment that would be measured in American lives. Most of the shells had fallen inland, beyond the primary defensive positions. The concrete bunkers remained intact. The machine gun nests remained operational. The mines remained armed. The heavy bomber attack that was supposed to have cratered the beach and destroyed German positions had dropped its payload too far inland, terrorizing Norman cows and accomplishing nothing against the fortifications. As the landing craft churned towards shore through the darkness, the men inside them knew none of this. They knew only what they had been told in the briefings, that resistance would be light, that the bombing and naval gunfire would have destroyed most German defenses, that they would secure the beach quickly and push inland before noon. Some believed these assurances. Others, particularly the veterans who had learned to distrust optimistic intelligence reports, harbored deep skepticism but kept it to themselves. All of them understood that within the next hour they would learn the truth, and that the truth would be written in blood and fire and the screams of dying men. The sky began to lighten imperceptibly to the east. Dawn came late at this latitude in early June, and in the overcast conditions the transition from night to day was gradual and gray. As visibility improved, the soldiers could begin to make out the shapes of other landing craft around them, dozens upon dozens of them, all heading toward the same destination, all carrying their human cargo through the rough seas toward the dark mass of land that was beginning to emerge from the gloom ahead. The sight should have been reassuring, evidence that they were not alone, that this was indeed the great invasion they had been told about, that the strength of the Allied forces would be overwhelming. Instead, many men found the sight unsettling, a reminder of how many witnesses there would be to their fear, to their failure if they failed, to their death if they died. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, with the landing scheduled for H hour at 6:30, the naval bombardment reached its crescendo. Battleships and cruisers and destroyers poured fire onto the beach and the bluffs behind it. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous rolling thunder that drowned out thought, that made communication impossible, that seemed to shake the very sea itself. Rockets streamed overhead in salvos, leaving trails of smoke and sparks across the gray sky. To the men in the landing craft, it seemed inconceivable that anything could survive such violence, that any German soldier could remain alive and capable of fighting after such punishment. They took what comfort they could from this belief. though some of the veterans remembered other beaches where the preliminary bombardment had seemed just as impressive and just as futile. The coxswains who piloted the landing craft faced their own desperate challenges. The tides and currents were stronger than predicted, pushing the small vessels eastward along the coast, away from their designated landing sectors. The smoke and dust thrown up by the bombardment obscured the landmarks they had been told to look for. The rough seas made steering difficult and threatened to swamp the boats entirely if they broached sideways to the waves. Many of the coxswains were young sailors who had never been in combat, who had trained in calmer waters, who now found themselves responsible for delivering soldiers to the exact right stretch of beach while waves crashed over the bow and men vomited in the stern and German shells began to fall among the approaching craft. Because the Germans had not waited for the Americans to reach the shore before opening fire. As the landing craft came within range, German artillery observers on the bluffs called down fire on the dark shapes moving through the gray water. Shells began to explode in the water around the craft, throwing up geysers of white foam and black smoke. Some shells hit their targets directly. A landing craft would simply vanish in a flash of orange flame and a concussion that could be felt in nearby vessels. And when the smoke cleared, there would be nothing left except debris and bodies floating face down in the water. Other craft were holed below the waterline and began to sink, their ramps jammed shut, their occupants trapped inside as the sea rushed in and pulled them down into the cold darkness. The first wave was scheduled to hit the beach at 6:30. The actual landings occurred over a span of nearly 10 minutes as the scattered landing craft arrived separately rather than in the coordinated line that had been planned. This dispersion, caused by the tides and the smoke and the chaos of battle, meant that the Germans could concentrate their fire on each craft individually rather than being overwhelmed by a simultaneous assault along the entire beach. It meant that small groups of men would have to fight alone, without the support of units that were supposed to be landing beside them. It meant that the carefully coordinated plan was already falling apart before the first soldiers set foot on French soil. The sound that the soldiers heard when the ramps dropped was unlike anything that most of them had imagined. It was not the dramatic crack of rifle fire or the distant thump of artillery. It was the sustained, ripping roar of German machine guns firing at cyclic rate, pouring bullets into the landing craft at a rate of hundreds of rounds per minute. The MG-42 machine gun, which the German army had deployed in numbers across Omaha Beach, was arguably the finest such weapon produced by any nation during the war. It fired at a rate nearly twice as fast as its American counterpart, creating a sound that veterans would later describe as similar to tearing cloth, a sound that meant death was arriving faster than the human mind could process. When the ramps dropped, men at the front of the landing craft had no choice. They were pressed forward by the soldiers behind them, pushed out into the water and into the fire by sheer physical pressure and the momentum of bodies trying to escape the trap of the craft itself. Some men were killed before they even stepped off the ramp, cut down by machine gun fire that swept across the opening like a scythe. Their bodies fell into the water or collapsed on the ramp itself, and the men behind them had to step over corpses or push them aside to get out, to get anywhere, to do anything except stand still and die in place. The water was deeper than it was supposed to be. Many landing craft had been unable to get close to shore because of the obstacles and the shell fire, and had dropped their ramps in water that was chest deep or deeper. Men laden with 60 pounds of equipment and ammunition stepped off into this water and sank like stones. Some managed to struggle forward, their boots finding purchase on the sandy bottom, their heads barely above water, their rifles held high to keep them dry. Others went under and did not come up again, drowned by the weight of their own gear before they had a chance to fight, their bodies settling onto the channel floor to become part of the terrible accounting that would be made later. Those who made it through the deep water and began to wade toward shore found themselves in a killing zone that had been designed with diabolical precision. The Germans had positioned their machine guns to create what military planners call interlocking fields of fire, meaning that any point on the beach could be targeted by at least 2 and often 3 or more weapons simultaneously. A soldier who thought he had found cover from one machine gun would discover that he was exposed to another. The gunners did not need to aim carefully at individual targets. They simply fired in sustained bursts at waist or chest height, hosing bullets across the waterline and the tidal flat, knowing that at any given moment there would be men in their line of fire. The bullets made small splashes in the water around the struggling soldiers, innocent-looking little geysers that betrayed nothing of their lethal intent. Men fell without drama, simply collapsing forward into the water or slowly sinking as their strength left them. Others cried out, their voices lost in the roar of gunfire and explosions. The sea around the landing craft began to turn pink, then red, as blood mixed with salt water and spread in diffusing clouds that followed the tides. Some soldiers made the decision, conscious or unconscious, to jettison their equipment in order to survive. They unbuckled their packs and let them sink. They dropped their rifles. They shed their ammunition belts and their gas masks and everything else that had weight, choosing life over mission, choosing the possibility of fighting later over the certainty of drowning now. This was not cowardice. This was the most basic human instinct for survival asserting itself in the face of immediate death. Many of these men would still die, cut down by machine gun fire after they had shed their gear, but some would make it ashore alive even if they arrived unarmed and unable to fight. Others clung to their equipment with a determination that bordered on the irrational, refusing to surrender the tools of their trade even as the weight pulled them under. Some of these men drowned. Others made it to shore through sheer physical strength and will, though they were often too exhausted to fight effectively once they arrived. The question of whether to keep one's equipment or discard it to survive was one that each man had to answer for himself in a matter of seconds, with no time for reflection, with no guidance from training or doctrine, with nothing but instinct and whatever reserves of courage or stubbornness or terror he possessed. The beach itself, when the soldiers finally reached it, offered no sanctuary. The coarse sand provided no cover. The smooth stones that littered parts of the beach were too small to hide behind. The wooden obstacles and steel barriers, which might have provided some protection, were often positioned in ways that exposed soldiers to fire from multiple directions if they tried to shelter behind them. The only real cover lay at the base of the bluffs, where the angle of the slope created dead zones that German machine guns could not reach. But the base of the bluffs was 300 yards from the waterline across open sand, 300 yards that had to be crossed under fire, 300 yards that separated the men pinned down at the water's edge from any hope of survival. The plan had called for combat engineers to land with the first wave, to blow gaps through the obstacles while the tide was still low, to clear lanes through the minefields, to destroy the German fortifications with satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes. The engineers landed as ordered, carrying explosives that weighed as much as the combat loads of the riflemen. But they landed under the same murderous fire as everyone else, and they died in the same numbers. Worse, when engineers were killed, their explosives often detonated, killing everyone nearby. Soldiers who thought they had found cover behind a steel obstacle would be obliterated when the explosive charges attached to that obstacle were set off by enemy fire or by the dying action of a wounded engineer. The beach became littered with the bodies of engineers who had tried to do their job and had been cut down before they could complete it. The Sherman tanks that were supposed to provide fire support for the infantry had largely failed to arrive. They had been launched from landing craft thousands of yards offshore in a misguided attempt to give them more time to engage German positions during the approach. But the duplex drive tanks, modified with flotation screens to allow them to swim to shore, had been launched into seas that were too rough for them to handle. 27 of the 32 tanks assigned to support the assault on the eastern sector of Omaha Beach sank in the deep water, taking their crews with them. The few tanks that did make it to shore quickly became targets for German anti-tank guns and were knocked out or disabled, their burning hulks adding to the obstacles that infantry had to navigate. Without engineer support, without tank support, without most of the specialized equipment that was supposed to have made the assault possible, the infantry of the first wave found themselves facing fortifications that were essentially intact and fully manned. The German defenders, who had waded through the naval bombardment in their deep bunkers, had emerged when the firing stopped and had taken their positions behind their weapons. They had survived. Their guns had survived. And now they opened fire on targets that were so numerous and so exposed that even mediocre shooters could hardly miss. The casualties in the first minutes were catastrophic. Entire boat sections were wiped out. Companies that should have landed with 190 men hit the beach with less than half that number. The rest killed in the landing craft, or drowned in the water, or cut down during the way to shore. Some units effectively ceased to exist as fighting organizations within the first 5 minutes of the landing. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, was nearly destroyed in the opening minutes. The company commander, the executive officer, and most of the platoon leaders were killed or wounded before they could organize any coherent action. Soldiers who had trained together for months or years were suddenly alone, cut off from their units, unable to locate their officers or their sergeants, forced to make decisions for themselves in circumstances that no amount of training had really prepared them for. The soldiers who survived the initial slaughter found themselves pinned down at the waterline or among the beach obstacles, unable to advance and unable to retreat. Behind them was the sea and the approaching tide, which would eventually drown anyone who remained at the water's edge. Ahead was 300 yards of open sand swept by fire from weapons they could not see and could not suppress. To stand up was to die. To stay in place was to die slowly. The only option that offered any hope of survival was to move forward, but moving forward required a kind of courage that transcended anything these men had known before. Some found that courage in rage. They had watched their friends killed beside them. They had seen things in the last few minutes that no human being should have to see. The rage that came from this, the pure, furious anger at the enemy and at the situation and at the unfairness of it all, propelled some men forward when reason would have frozen them in place. They rose from the water or from behind whatever inadequate cover they had found, and they ran toward the enemy guns with their rifles raised and their voices raised in inarticulate shouts that were part war cry and part scream of defiant terror. Others found courage in duty. They were soldiers. They had a mission. Their training, imperfect as it had been for this situation, had instilled in them the understanding that soldiers must advance even under fire, that the only way to end the killing was to close with the enemy and destroy him. These men moved forward because that was what soldiers did, because staying in place was not an option, because the entire structure of their military identity demanded that they fulfill their role, even if that role led directly to death. Still others found courage in leadership. Scattered among the chaos were officers and sergeants who had not been killed in the initial minutes, who retained enough presence of mind to assess the situation and to understand that the only salvation lay in forward movement. These leaders began to organize the men around them, shouting orders that could barely be heard over the gunfire, using hand signals and physical force to get soldiers moving, leading by example in the most literal sense by standing up and advancing and trusting that others would follow. One such leader was Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division. Cota had landed with the early waves and found himself among soldiers who were paralyzed by fear and the sheer, overwhelming nature of the situation they faced. He moved among them, apparently oblivious to the fire that was killing men all around him, shouting encouragement and orders. He organized small groups of soldiers and led them forward in short rushes, from one piece of cover to the next, demonstrating that movement was possible even under fire. His presence and his calm authority in the midst of chaos gave men something to focus on besides their fear, gave them a reason to stand up and move when every instinct screamed at them to burrow into the sand and wait for death to find them. Cota was not alone in this. All along the beach, junior officers and non-commissioned officers were performing similar acts of leadership, though most of their names would never be recorded because they did not survive the day or because they were too junior and too numerous to be individually documented. A lieutenant with a shattered arm continued to direct his men until blood loss rendered him unconscious. A sergeant gathered soldiers from 3 different companies who had become separated from their units and led them in an assault on a machine gun position. A captain who had lost most of his company in the water organized the survivors into a makeshift platoon and led them up a ravine toward the bluffs, calling back encouragement even as bullets struck the ground around him. The medics, who wore brassards marked with red crosses and who were theoretically protected under the Geneva Convention, discovered that the Germans either could not distinguish them from combatants or chose not to. They were shot while treating wounded men. They were killed while trying to drag casualties to safety. But they continued their work with a dedication that bordered on the suicidal, moving across the beach toward the sounds of men calling for help, kneeling in exposed positions to apply tourniquets or morphine or pressure dressings, staying with wounded soldiers who could not move on their own, even though staying meant becoming a target. One medic worked for 3 hours in the same small area of beach, treating wound after wound while bullets kicked up sand around him. He used up his supplies and began taking medical supplies from the dead. When he ran out of morphine, he stayed with the wounded anyway, offering what comfort words could provide, holding the hands of dying men so they would not die alone. He was eventually killed by a mortar round that landed directly in the group of casualties he was treating, but by that time, he had saved the lives of perhaps a dozen soldiers who would otherwise have bled out on the sand. The officers attempting to coordinate the assault faced challenges that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. Communications had broken down almost entirely. The radios that were supposed to allow communication between the beach and the ships offshore had been lost when landing craft sank or had been destroyed by enemy fire or rendered useless by seawater. Officers who wanted to call for naval gunfire support or report on conditions ashore found themselves unable to do so. The units scattered along the beach could not communicate with each other. Company commanders did not know where their companies were. Battalion commanders did not know which of their companies had made it ashore and which had been destroyed. Regimental commanders on the command ships offshore had almost no information about what was happening on the beach itself. This breakdown of communications meant that much of what happened on Omaha Beach that morning occurred without central direction or coordination. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes no more than a squad or even a fire team, found themselves acting independently, making their own tactical decisions, identifying their own objectives, and attacking them without orders from higher command. In a conventional battle, this fragmentation of command and control would have been disastrous. At Omaha Beach, it may have been what saved the assault from complete failure, because the dispersion of forces and the breakdown of communications meant that the attack did not follow predictable patterns. The Germans had based their defensive plan on the assumption that the Americans would try to exit the beach via the 5 valleys or draws that cut through the bluffs at intervals along Omaha Beach. These draws represented the only practical routes off the beach for vehicles and heavy equipment, and the Germans had fortified them heavily, positioning bunkers and gun positions to create kill zones that would slaughter any force that attempted to use them. The American plan had indeed called for pushing up these draws as quickly as possible, but the chaos of the landing and the independent actions of small unit leaders meant that soldiers began to find other ways off the beach. Some soldiers noticed that between the fortified draws were areas where the bluffs, while steep, were not vertical, where vegetation grew on the slope, where erosion had created gullies and ledges. It might be possible to climb. These routes would be difficult and dangerous, requiring soldiers to scramble up slopes while carrying their equipment, exposed to fire from above, with no guarantee that they could reach the top or that there would be any cover when they did. But difficult and dangerous was better than impossible, and the approaches through the draws were beginning to look impossible as German fire concentrated on those obvious routes. The Rangers of the 2nd Battalion faced a different kind of impossible task. Their mission was to scale the vertical cliffs at Point du Hoc, a promontory between Omaha Beach and Utah Beach to the west, where intelligence reports indicated the Germans had positioned a battery of 6 155mm guns capable of firing on both landing beaches. The Rangers were to scale the cliffs using rope ladders and grappling hooks, reach the top, and destroy the guns, all under fire from German defenders above them. The Rangers were delayed in their approach by the rough seas and the strong currents, arriving at Point du Hoc 40 minutes later than planned. This delay meant that the element of surprise was lost, and that German defenders were fully alert and waiting. When the Rangers reached the base of the cliffs and fired their rocket-propelled grapples upward, German soldiers appeared at the cliff edge and began dropping hand grenades and shooting down at the climbers. Some grapples were cut loose by the defenders. Some failed to find purchase in the muddy ground at the cliff top. Rangers dangled on ropes over a 100-foot drop, while bullets and grenades sought them out. But the Rangers climbed anyway. They had trained for exactly this mission. They were among the most physically fit and mentally tough soldiers in the American Army, and they would not be deterred by casualties or by the seeming impossibility of their task. One by one, hand over hand, they pulled themselves up the cliff face while their comrades below provided covering fire with whatever weapons they could bring to bear. Men were killed during the climb, their bodies falling back into the sea or hanging in their harnesses against the cliff face. But others kept climbing, and eventually the first Rangers reached the top. What they found there was both a relief and a betrayal. The massive coastal guns that were supposed to have been positioned at Point du Hoc were not in their casemates. The Germans had moved them inland to protect them from naval bombardment. The Rangers had climbed a cliff under fire and taken significant casualties to capture a position that did not contain the primary objective of their mission. But they held the position anyway, setting up a defensive perimeter on the cliff top, because holding ground that had been bought with the blood of their comrades was what Rangers did. And later, small patrols would push inland and find the guns hidden in an apple orchard and would destroy them with thermite grenades, completing the mission even though the cost had been far higher than anyone had anticipated. Back on Omaha Beach, the situation remained desperate throughout the morning. The tide was coming in, reducing the area of beach available to the thousands of men who were still trying to land. Bodies rolled in the surf. Wounded men cried out for help that often did not come. Burning vehicles and landing craft added smoke to the haze that obscured the battlefield. German gunners continued to fire methodically, picking off targets as they presented themselves, working through their ammunition at a sustainable rate because there was no need to hurry when the targets were so numerous and so exposed. But slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance began to shift. The destroyer captains offshore, frustrated by their inability to communicate with the beach and horrified by what they could see through their binoculars, made a decision that violated their orders but saved the assault. They brought their ships in close to shore, so close that they risked running aground, and began to fire directly at German bunkers and gun positions. Their 5-inch guns could not penetrate the heavy concrete of the main bunkers, but they could destroy observation posts and communication trenches and suppress German fire long enough for soldiers to move. On the beach itself, small groups of soldiers had begun to organize themselves into effective fighting units. They might not know each other. They might be from different companies or different battalions, or even different divisions. But they were American infantrymen, and they knew how to work together even without formal command structure. A squad would form around a sergeant whose own squad had been wiped out. A lieutenant whose platoon was scattered would gather men from other platoons and lead them forward. Soldiers who had lost their rifles picked up weapons from the dead and rejoined the fight. The Bangalore torpedoes that were supposed to have been used to clear lanes through the wire and mines were now being employed by whoever could find them. Soldiers who were not trained as engineers figured out how to assemble the sections and push them under the wire, how to attach the detonators, how to get everyone clear before the explosion. When the Bangalore went off, it would blow a gap in the wire and detonate any mines in the immediate area, creating a narrow path through the defenses. These paths were still covered by German fire, but they were paths, and that was better than nothing. The soldiers who made it to the base of the bluffs found some protection from the steepest angle of fire, though mortars could still reach them and Germans on the heights above could drop grenades or roll mines down the slopes. But at the base of the bluffs, they could pause, could catch their breath, could take stock of who had survived and what equipment remained. And from there, they could begin to organize for the climb. The climb itself was brutal. The slopes were steep enough that soldiers often had to use their hands to pull themselves upward, grasping at tufts of grass or small shrubs, finding footholds in the crumbling dirt. A man who lost his grip might slide back down, taking others with him. A man who was shot while climbing would fall, his body tumbling down the slope. But the Germans had difficulty bringing effective fire to bear on the slopes directly below their positions. The angle was too steep. The soldiers climbing were often below the field of fire machine guns positioned on the crest. This gave the attackers a small advantage, and they exploited it ruthlessly. As more and more soldiers reached the top of the bluffs, they began to attack the German positions from behind. The bunkers that had been impregnable from the front were vulnerable from the rear, where they had openings for access and ventilation. American soldiers would work their way through the trenches toward a bunker, then throw grenades through the rear entrance or fire rifles and submachine guns into the opening. When a bunker was neutralized, the German fire from that position would stop, and more soldiers could advance across the beach below. By mid-morning, the situation on Omaha Beach, while still chaotic and deadly, had evolved from imminent catastrophic failure to something that might, with continued effort and continued sacrifice, be turned into a foothold. The beach was secure in the sense that men could now cross it, though they would do so under fire, and some would still die in the crossing. The bluffs were being scaled in multiple locations, not just at the draws, but along the entire length of the beach, wherever soldiers found routes that could be climbed. The German defenses, while still formidable, were beginning to show gaps as bunkers were taken and gun positions destroyed. But the cost had been appalling. By noon, when the beach was supposed to have been secured and forces should have been pushing inland toward their first-day objectives, the Americans had advanced only a few hundred yards beyond the beach itself. Casualties approached 40% in some units. The beach was littered with the dead and wounded, with destroyed equipment and burning vehicles. The water's edge was marked by a windrow of bodies that rose and fell with the waves. The draws that were supposed to have provided easy access off the beach remained contested. Some units had effectively ceased to exist. The carefully planned assault had devolved into a desperate, improvised brawl conducted by small groups of soldiers acting on their own initiative. And yet they had not been defeated. They had not retreated. They had not surrendered. Despite facing defenses far stronger than they had been led to expect, despite losses that would have broken less determined forces, despite every circumstance suggesting that the wise course was to withdraw and reconsider the assault, the American soldiers on Omaha Beach had kept fighting. They had kept moving forward. They had adapted to circumstances that bore no resemblance to their training. They had continued to function even when their command structure had been shattered and their communications severed. The senior commanders offshore, who had only fragmentary information about conditions on the beach, had spent much of the morning considering whether to divert follow-on forces to other beaches where the landings had been more successful. The thought of abandoning Omaha, of accepting that the assault there had failed, was almost too terrible to contemplate, but it seemed for several hours during the morning that failure might be the only realistic outcome. Casualty reports, when they could be obtained at all, were devastating. Naval observers reported that the beach appeared to be completely blocked by obstacles and wreckage. Small craft coxswains returning from the beach described conditions that seemed to make further landings suicidal. But the soldiers on the beach had not asked permission to fail. They had simply refused to do so. A private first class from Missouri who found himself the senior surviving soldier in his platoon led 8 men in an assault on a machine gun nest and captured 12 German soldiers. A staff sergeant from New York organized a collection of soldiers from 4 different companies and led them through a minefield by following the footsteps of the engineers who had died trying to mark safe lanes. A young officer, commissioned less than 6 months earlier, took command of a company whose commander and all its other officers had been killed and led it in an attack up a draw that was supposed to have been impassable. These were not the actions of superhuman warriors. They were the actions of ordinary men pushed beyond ordinary limits, of soldiers who discovered reserves of courage they had not known they possessed, of young Americans who refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable and perhaps even logical. They were cold and wet and exhausted and terrified. Many were wounded. Many had seen their friends killed. All of them had every reason to stop, to find a shell crater or a piece of wreckage to hide behind and wait for someone else to win the battle. But they did not stop. They kept moving forward, yard by yard, minute by minute, through an afternoon that would demand from them everything they had and more. By early afternoon, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. The initial desperate struggle for survival had evolved into a grinding effort to expand the foothold that had been won at such terrible cost. The German defenders, who had inflicted catastrophic casualties during the morning, now found themselves under pressure from multiple directions as American soldiers worked their way through the bluff defenses and began to attack strongpoints from positions the Germans had not anticipated. The bunkers and trenches that had dominated the beach were increasingly isolated as soldiers infiltrated between them, cutting communication lines and eliminating observation posts. The Germans fought with the professionalism and determination that characterized their army throughout the war. They counterattacked when opportunities presented themselves. They shifted forces to plug gaps in their lines. They called down artillery fire on American positions even when those positions were dangerously close to their own troops. But they were fighting at a disadvantage now. The overwhelming naval gunfire and the sheer number of Americans continuing to land meant that the defenders were being worn down through attrition. A machine gun crew that expended all its ammunition could not be resupplied easily. A bunker that was surrounded could not be reinforced. The Germans had built their defenses to stop an attack at the waterline, and now the attack had penetrated past the waterline and was consuming those defenses from within. The Americans continued to suffer casualties throughout the afternoon, but the nature of those casualties had changed. In the morning, men had died helplessly, cut down by fire from positions they could not see and could not reach. Now they were dying in close combat, in firefights where they could at least shoot back, in assaults on bunkers and trenches where courage and skill and luck might make the difference between life and death. The dying was no less terrible, but it felt less futile. Progress could be measured. Ground could be held. The mission could be accomplished even if the cost remained horrific. Company commanders who had lost most of their men in the initial landing now found stragglers from their units and began to reconstitute their companies into fighting formations. A captain who had landed with 15 survivors from a company of 190 spent the afternoon collecting soldiers who had become separated during the chaos. By evening, he had assembled nearly 60 men, enough to function as an understrength company, enough to take and hold objectives. These reconstituted units lacked their full equipment, and their cohesion was improvised rather than trained, but they were led by officers and sergeants who had proven themselves under the worst possible conditions, and they fought with the intensity of men who had already been through hell and had nothing left to fear. The Rangers at Point du Hoc, who had accomplished their mission of destroying the coastal guns, found themselves cut off and surrounded as German forces counterattacked throughout the day. The Rangers held their position on the cliff top with dwindling ammunition and mounting casualties, beating back repeated German assaults while waiting for relief that was agonizingly slow in coming. They had landed with 225 men. By the time they were finally relieved on the second day, less than 90 were still capable of fighting. But they had held. The Germans had thrown everything available at them, had attacked again and again, and the Rangers had refused to be dislodged from the ground they had taken. On Omaha Beach itself, engineers were finally able to begin the work they had been sent to do. With the German defenses partially suppressed, with some measure of control established over portions of the beach, engineer units could start clearing obstacles and mines in a systematic rather than suicidal manner. They worked under fire because the beach was never truly safe that day, but the fire was sporadic rather than constant, and it was possible to take precautions. Demolition teams moved among the beach obstacles, placing charges and blowing gaps that would allow landing craft to reach the shore more safely. Other engineers used mine detectors to locate and mark safe paths through the minefields, or simply probe the ground with bayonets in the time-honored and terrifying method of finding mines by nearly stepping on them. The follow-on waves of troops and equipment that had been delayed by the morning chaos began to land in increasing numbers. These soldiers had spent hours circling offshore in their landing craft, watching the battle unfold on the beach, seeing the fires and the explosions and the bodies in the water, knowing that their turn was coming and dreading it with an intensity that was almost paralyzing. When they finally landed, Many expected to encounter the same slaughter that had devastated the first waves. Instead, they found a beach that was still dangerous but navigable, still under fire, but no longer a pure killing ground. They took casualties, but not at the catastrophic rates of the morning. They were able to move across the beach to the base of the bluffs, to join the units already pushing inland, to add their strength to an assault that was gaining momentum even as it ground forward at agonizing cost. The artillery that was supposed to have supported the assault from the beginning finally began to arrive. The initial plan had called for artillery to land early, to provide fire support for the infantry as they pushed inland. But the guns could not land until the beach was secure enough for their crews to survive and for their prime movers to get off the beach without being destroyed. By mid-afternoon, artillery batteries were setting up in positions just beyond the beach, registering their guns, and preparing to fire missions in support of the infantry attacking German positions inland. The gunners worked with frantic intensity, knowing that infantrymen were fighting and dying while waiting for the fire support that artillery could provide. Medical personnel established aid stations in whatever cover they could find, usually in the lee of the bluffs or in captured German bunkers. The wounded who could walk made their way to these aid stations on their own. Those who could not walk were carried by stretcher bearers who moved back and forth across the beach throughout the day, collecting casualties and bringing them to the surgeons. The aid stations were overwhelmed almost immediately. Surgeons performed triage, making terrible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help, working on patient after patient without pause, their hands and uniforms soaked with blood, their minds focused on the immediate task of stopping bleeding and treating shock and saving whoever could be saved. The less seriously wounded were tagged and moved to the beach for evacuation to hospital ships offshore. But evacuation proved difficult throughout the day. Landing craft that brought troops and equipment to the beach were supposed to take wounded back on the return trip, but many coxswains were reluctant to approach the beach even in the afternoon when conditions had improved, having seen what the morning had been like. Some wounded men waited for hours on the beach for evacuation, their pain managed by morphine syrettes, their survival dependent on whether they could hold on until transport became available. Some did not hold on. Some died waiting, their wounds ultimately fatal despite the best efforts of the medics who had treated them. The psychological toll of the day's fighting was enormous, though it would not be fully recognized until later. Soldiers witnessed things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They saw friends killed in ways that were sudden and violent and impossible to prepare for. They saw wounds that revealed the fragility of the human body in the face of modern weapons. They made decisions that resulted in men dying or not dying and would spend decades wondering if they had made the right choices. Some broke under the strain during the battle itself, retreating into catatonic states where they could not respond to orders or could not stop shaking or simply sat and stared at nothing. Others would break later, days or weeks afterward, when the immediate danger had passed and their minds finally had time to process what they had experienced. But most did not break. Most continued to function, to follow orders, to fight effectively even as exhaustion and stress accumulated. They learned to compartmentalize, to focus on the immediate task, and push everything else aside to be dealt with later. They learned to keep moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant confronting the horror of what they had just lived through. So they moved forward, up the bluffs, inland toward objectives whose names they often did not know, following orders or following other soldiers, or simply following the momentum of an attack that had somehow, against all probability, succeeded in establishing itself ashore. As evening approached, the Americans held a beachhead that extended roughly 1.5 miles inland at its deepest point and covered perhaps 6 miles of coastline. This was far short of the planned objectives for the day, which had called for an advance of several miles inland and the link-up with British forces attacking to the east. The Germans still held most of the high ground. They still controlled the roads and the villages inland. They had not been defeated or routed, but they had been pushed back from the beach itself, pushed back from the bluffs, pushed back into defensive positions where they could no longer directly fire on the landing zones. The immediate crisis had passed. Reinforcements and supplies could now land with a reasonable expectation of getting off the beach alive. The invasion had a foothold. The cost of that foothold was calculated in the bodies that lay along the beach and in the water and scattered across the bluffs. The exact number of American casualties on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, has never been determined with absolute certainty. The chaos of the battle, the destruction of unit records, the difficulty of distinguishing between men who were killed and men who were missing and men who were wounded and evacuated all contributed to uncertainty in the accounting. The best estimates suggest that approximately 2,400 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the day. Some units suffered far worse. Companies that had landed in the first wave had casualty rates exceeding 90%. The 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division lost more than 300 men. The 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division lost similar numbers. The Rangers at Point du Hoc had been nearly destroyed as a fighting force. These losses were staggering by any measure, far exceeding what had been anticipated even in the most pessimistic planning. They represented sons and husbands and fathers and brothers, men who had crossed an ocean to fight for a cause they believed in, men who had died on a beach in France far from everything they knew and loved. Their bodies would be collected in the days following the battle and buried in temporary cemeteries near the beach, though many would later be reinterred in the American cemetery that would be established overlooking Omaha Beach, where thousands of white crosses and stars of David would mark the cost of that day and the days of fighting that followed. But the losses, terrible as they were, did not constitute failure. The mission had been to land on Omaha Beach, to break through the German defenses, to establish a beachhead that could be expanded and reinforced. That mission had been accomplished. It had been accomplished later than planned, at greater cost than anticipated, through methods that bore little resemblance to the detailed operational plan. It had been accomplished through the courage and determination and sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit of individual soldiers who made individual decisions to stand up and move forward when every rational calculation suggested that staying down was the only way to survive. The officers who landed at Omaha Beach that day would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand what had happened, trying to analyze the tactical decisions and the intelligence failures and the operational mistakes that had resulted in such catastrophic losses. Some would blame the planners who had underestimated German strength. Some would blame the naval bombardment that had failed to destroy the fortifications. Some would blame the weather that had scattered the landing craft and sunk the tanks. All of these factors had contributed to the near disaster of the morning. But when pressed to explain why the assault had ultimately succeeded despite these failures, most officers would return to the same answer. The soldiers had made it succeed through individual initiative and small unit leadership, and a refusal to accept defeat. This was not the answer that doctrine suggested. Military theory held that successful assaults required careful planning, effective coordination, overwhelming firepower, and centralized command and control. Omaha Beach had featured almost none of these elements. The plan had fallen apart within minutes. Coordination had been impossible. Firepower had been inadequate. Command and control had broken down completely. And yet the assault had succeeded because individual soldiers and small units had adapted and improvised and fought with a determination that transcended training and doctrine. The performance of American soldiers at Omaha Beach challenged assumptions that had been held by both their allies and their enemies. The British and Canadians, who had been fighting since 1939, had sometimes questioned whether American troops, most of whom had never seen combat, would be able to stand up to German veterans in a major battle. The Germans themselves, who had been crushing opponents across Europe for 5 years, had confidence in their ability to defeat any assault on their fortified positions. Omaha Beach provided answers to both sets of doubts. The Americans had proven that they could fight, not just fight when conditions were favorable and when the plan was working, but fight when everything had gone wrong, when casualties were overwhelming, when leadership was decapitated, when the situation appeared hopeless. They had proven that they could adapt to circumstances that their training had not prepared them for. They had proven that individual soldiers could make tactical decisions appropriate to their situation without waiting for orders from higher command. They had proven that they would not break even under conditions that would have justified breaking, that would have made surrender or retreat understandable, and perhaps even rational. This was a different kind of courage than the kind displayed in the early years of the war by British forces that had stood alone against Nazi Germany, or by Soviet forces that had bled and died in unimaginable numbers to stop the German advance in the East. The British and Soviet courage had been the courage of survival, of holding on despite defeat after defeat, of refusing to surrender even when surrender seemed inevitable. American courage at Omaha Beach was the courage of the assault, of accepting terrible casualties in the service of an offensive mission, of continuing to attack even when the attack appeared to have failed. The Germans who had defended Omaha Beach had fought with the skill and determination that characterized their army throughout the war. They had inflicted casualties far exceeding anything the Americans had expected. They had come very close to stopping the invasion in its sector. But in the end, they had not stopped it. They had killed thousands of American soldiers, but more Americans had kept coming. They had destroyed companies and battalions, but other companies and battalions had taken their places. They had held positions brilliantly designed and courageously defended, but individual American soldiers had found ways around those positions, or through them, or over them. The Germans had done everything their doctrine and their training and their experience suggested they should do, and it had not been enough. In the months and years that followed, the story of Omaha Beach would be told and retold, analyzed and debated, commemorated and memorialized. It would become part of American military culture, a touchstone for discussions of courage and leadership and the individual soldier's role in battle. Veterans of Omaha Beach would carry the memory of that day with them always, a memory that was both a source of pride and a source of pain, a memory of what they had accomplished and of what it had cost them and their comrades. But the immediate significance of Omaha Beach was strategic rather than cultural. The successful landing meant that the Allies now had a foothold in France from which they could expand. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had declared impregnable, had been breached. German forces would fight with desperate skill and determination in the weeks and months ahead, but they would be fighting a defensive battle against growing Allied strength rather than defending static positions against isolated attacks. The successful landing at Omaha Beach, combined with the landings at the other beaches on June 6th and the airborne operations inland, meant that the liberation of Western Europe had truly begun. The men who made that liberation possible, who stormed ashore at Omaha Beach and fought their way inland despite everything the Germans could do to stop them, came from every corner of America. They were farmers and mechanics, teachers and factory workers, college students, and men who had never finished high school. They were volunteers and draftees. They were young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, who should have been starting careers or families or the ordinary peaceful pursuits of peacetime life. Instead, they were soldiers, thrust into a battle that tested them beyond anything they had imagined possible. What united them was not ideology or political belief or abstract commitment to grand causes, though many of them believed deeply in the rightness of the war against Nazi Germany. What united them in the critical hours of June 6th was something more immediate and more human. They fought for the men beside them. They fought because stopping meant letting down their comrades. They fought because they were soldiers and fighting was what soldiers did. They fought because in the midst of chaos and death and overwhelming fear, the simple act of doing one's duty provided a framework for action, a way of moving forward when every instinct screamed to retreat. The generation that fought at Omaha Beach and in the campaigns that followed would later be called the greatest generation, a label that many of them found uncomfortable and even embarrassing. They did not think of themselves as particularly great. They had done what they had to do, what circumstances required of them, what duty and loyalty and simple human decency demanded. They had been terrified. They had wanted to survive. They had wished desperately to be anywhere else. But they had gone forward anyway, and in going forward they had accomplished something that resonated far beyond the tactical victory of securing a beachhead on a French beach. They had demonstrated that free men could fight as effectively as the ideologically indoctrinated soldiers of totalitarian regimes. They had proven that citizen soldiers, civilians in uniform, could match and exceed the performance of professional military forces when the cause was just and the need was great. They had shown that individual initiative and small unit leadership could overcome the advantages of prepared positions and interior lines. They had made it clear that the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, that the Allies possessed not just material superiority, but moral strength sufficient to press home their attacks regardless of cost. The world that watched the events of June 6, 1944, understood this even if it took time for the full implications to become clear. The British and the other allies, who had waited years for the Second Front that would take pressure off the Soviet Union and begin the liberation of Western Europe, saw in the successful landings the fulfillment of promises made and the beginning of the final campaigns. The neutral nations, who had wondered whether American industrial might would translate into military effectiveness, received their answer in the blood and determination displayed on the beaches of Normandy. The occupied peoples of Europe, who had suffered under Nazi rule for years, took heart from the knowledge that liberation was finally underway. And the Germans, who had conquered most of Europe through superior tactics and better trained forces, now understood that they faced an enemy that would not be deterred by casualties, would not be stopped by fortifications, would not accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. The German generals who analyzed the Battle of Normandy and its aftermath would identify many factors that contributed to their eventual failure to contain the beachhead: inadequate mobile reserves, Hitler's interference with tactical decisions, Allied air superiority, the effectiveness of the naval bombardment. But privately, many would acknowledge that they had underestimated the quality and determination of the American soldier, and that this miscalculation had proven costly. Omaha Beach became the supreme test of the American military in the Second World War, not because it was the largest battle or the most strategically significant, but because it was the moment when everything went wrong and American soldiers succeeded anyway. It was the moment when the carefully laid plans proved inadequate and individual soldiers made the difference through their own courage and initiative. It was the moment when units were shattered and rebuilt themselves on the fly. It was the moment when the cost was highest and the will to continue might reasonably have failed, but did not fail. The men who fought there never forgot what it had cost. They carried physical scars from wounds that healed and wounds that did not. They carried psychological scars from things they had seen and things they had done. They woke from nightmares decades later, still hearing the sound of machine guns or seeing the faces of friends who had died beside them. Some spoke of their experiences readily, wanting others to know what had happened, wanting the sacrifice to be remembered. Others never spoke of it at all, carrying their memories in silence because the words to describe what they had experienced did not seem to exist, or because speaking of it meant reliving it in ways they could not bear. But all of them, whether they spoke of it or remained silent, knew that they had been part of something extraordinary. They had participated in a battle that would be remembered as long as there were people who cared about courage and sacrifice and the capacity of ordinary human beings to perform extraordinary acts. They had done what they had been asked to do, paid the price that was demanded of them, and accomplished the mission despite everything that opposed them. They had not sought glory. Most had not even sought to be heroes. They had simply done their duty as they understood it, under circumstances more terrible than anyone should have to endure. The beach where they fought, where thousands of them died, where tens of thousands more would come ashore in the days and weeks following, would become a sacred place. The American cemetery established there, with its rows upon rows of white crosses stretching toward the sea, would serve as a permanent reminder of the cost of liberation. Visitors would come from around the world to stand at the edge of the bluff and look down at the sand where the battle had raged, and they would struggle to imagine how anyone could have survived the gauntlet of fire that the first waves had faced. They would read the names on the crosses and the walls of the missing, and they would understand that each name represented a life cut short, a family forever changed, a potential never realized. But those visitors would also understand something else. They would understand that the men who died at Omaha Beach and the men who survived had accomplished something that resonated far beyond the tactical and strategic objectives of the invasion. They had demonstrated that when freedom and tyranny met in direct confrontation, when the forces of democracy faced the armies of fascism, the outcome would not be determined solely by equipment or training or operational planning. It would be determined by the will to fight, by the refusal to accept defeat, by the capacity of individual soldiers to make decisions and take actions that transcended their own survival. Omaha Beach was the moment when the world saw that American soldiers, these young men drawn from farms and cities across a vast continent, men who had been civilians only months or years before, could be trusted with the most difficult and dangerous missions. It was a moment when doubts about American military capability were erased, when respect was earned through blood and determination, when the sacrifices of previous generations who had fought for American independence and preserved the Union were vindicated by the courage of a new generation facing its own defining trial. The legacy of Omaha Beach would shape American military culture for generations. It would be studied in staff colleges and war colleges as an example of how small unit leadership and individual initiative could overcome failed operational plans. It would be commemorated in films and books and memorials. It would serve as inspiration for soldiers in future wars who faced their own moments of crisis and needed to remember that Americans before them had faced worse and had not broken. The Rangers who climbed the cliffs at Point du Hoc, the infantry who crossed the killing zones under machine gun fire, the engineers who cleared obstacles while being shot at, the medics who treated wounded under fire, all of them would become part of a tradition of American military excellence that drew strength from their example. But perhaps the most important legacy of Omaha Beach was the simplest. It proved that Americans would fight. When everything went wrong, when the casualties mounted to unbearable levels, when retreat would have been understandable and perhaps even justified, American soldiers had chosen to advance instead. They had chosen to complete their mission even when completing it seemed impossible. They had chosen to honor their commitment to their comrades and their country even when that commitment demanded everything they had to give. This was not a lesson that could be taught in training or instilled through propaganda. It could only be demonstrated through action, proved through sacrifice, established through the accumulated decisions of thousands of individual soldiers in the most desperate circumstances imaginable. Omaha Beach provided that demonstration. It gave the world evidence, written in blood and courage and unbreakable determination, that when called upon to do the impossible, American soldiers would attempt it, that when told the odds were against them, they would fight anyway, that when faced with the choice between mission and survival, they would choose mission, that they would not break, not yield, not retreat, not surrender, even under conditions that would have justified any of those choices. And on that June morning in 1944, with the bodies of their friends washing in the tide and German guns still firing from the bluffs and every rational calculation suggesting that the assault had failed, the soldiers on Omaha Beach proved all of this to be true. They proved it not through speeches or declarations, but through actions. They stood up when staying down meant living and standing up meant likely death. They moved forward when every instinct screamed to move back. They fought when fighting seemed futile and continued fighting when the outcome remained in doubt. They did this not because they were superhuman, but because they were American soldiers, and American soldiers do not quit. This was the lesson of Omaha Beach. This was why that terrible day, with its catastrophic casualties and desperate fighting and near disaster averted only by the courage of individual soldiers, became not a story of failure, but a story of triumph. Not because the cost was acceptable, it never would be, but because the men who paid that cost accomplished what they set out to do. They secured the beach. They broke through the German defenses. They established the foothold from which the liberation of Europe would proceed. And in doing so, they established something else equally important. They established that American soldiers could be relied upon to complete their missions no matter what obstacles they faced, no matter what price had to be paid, no matter how desperate the situation appeared. The world learned this on June 6, 1944. It learned it from young Americans dying on a beach in France. It learned it from sergeants organizing soldiers they had never met before and leading them up bluffs under fire. It learned it from captains and lieutenants continuing to command even after they had been wounded. It learned it from medics treating casualties while being shot at. It learned it from soldiers who had every reason to give up but refused to do so. And once the world learned this lesson, once it understood what American soldiers were capable of when truly tested, the outcome of the war became certain. It would take 11 more months of fighting. It would cost hundreds of thousands more lives. But the will to victory had been demonstrated beyond question on that beach, and that demonstration changed everything. Omaha Beach was where American soldiers proved they would not break. It was where they proved they could be trusted with the hardest missions and the highest costs. It was where they proved that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. It was where ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds accomplished extraordinary things because their duty required it, and their comrades depended on it, and their country needed it. And it was where, in the most terrible test imaginable, under the worst conditions any soldier had faced in that war, they succeeded. Not easily, not without terrible cost, but succeeded nonetheless. And in succeeding, they earned a place in history that would endure as long as there were people who valued courage and sacrifice and the capacity of free men to fight for what they believed in.